asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
Massive story ongoing is the attempt to criminalise and to forbid speech or thoughts or ideas that some people might find harmful or might find offensive. Talked earlier in the week about the former rugby player Gareth Thomas, who famously came out as gay several years ago. Brilliant rugby player for Wales, centre, top player. He's been working with Damien Collins, the Digital Media and Culture Secretary. They want to criminalise alleged or so-called homophobic chanting at football matches, which is a strange thing for me as somebody who's been attending football matches all my life. Now, I came across my first guest this evening on Sky Television the other day, and he had a terrific interview with the presenter there about this and about how authoritarian this is and how and where this might lead in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of thought. He's a sociology and criminology lecturer, and he writes for newspapers, several newspapers in fact, on these issues, the criminalisation and over-regulation of everyday life. And he's written several books as well on these issues. And in fact, he mentioned the other day that there is a book in the pipeline called The Criminalisation of Everything. He's live in Dundee this evening. Let's welcome to the programme Dr. Stuart Waiton. Stuart, thanks so much for your time. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Can you hear me okay, yeah?
Loud and clear. You're getting the brunt. You're getting the brunt of the weather up there in Scotland today. I believe it's as warm there as it's ever been. How are you coping?
It's fantastic. I thought we might have a minute's applause for Germany before we started.
Yeah. Well, I know you're a Sunderland fan. I was watching Germany this afternoon. As an Irish guy, we didn't qualify, of course. Watching with open eyes to see Germany collapse as they did that. We could spend hours talking about that, but in the time I have with you, I want to talk about the things you write about, the articles you write, the books you write. How dangerous a time, Stuart, is this in terms of the health? How healthy are things at the moment in terms of people being able to express their ideas, whether those ideas are good, bad, indifferent or repugnant? How healthy are things now?
Yeah, they're very strange. I mean, I was involved in politics when I was a student. It's just amazing seeing how capitalism works and how it adopts things. Because 30 years ago, all the things I would be campaigning around were things like fighting racism, fighting homophobia, fighting for women's rights, right? And now they're all the things that fill me with horror, because they're all being used by the state and the police to regulate people's thoughts and words and ideas and so on. So it really is such a strange, interesting, macabre world that we've had this shift. Because 30 years ago these were radical campaigns fighting for liberation and equality and all the rest of it. Now they are essentially police campaigns and campaigns for awareness that relentlessly. It's just it's spiraling. That's the thing. It's the difficulty. Once we accept that we should stop people saying racist things, which sounds great, right? And on paper it sounds good. Stop people saying racist things. We don't like racism. As soon as that's in, the rest just follows. So now, if you're the latest one is this, as you saw me on Sky News, homophobia at football. So if someone's chanting or saying something to a player or saying he's gay or something like that, potentially being arrested for that as well. So you can see how these things just spiral and spiral. What
happened, Stuart? I, like yourself, I went to university twice. I'm that thick. I went twice, and I remember there was no such thing as deplatforming people. You spoke there quite eloquently about debating and arguing with people about racism, about sexism, about bad attitudes to gay men and women, and you would take them on and you would argue. You never ever sought to marginalise them or to shut them up. What has happened in the interim period? How have we reached this juncture?
Well, I think there's lots of things, but the radicals of the 70s and 80s, I think, gave up on their capacity to change society, and in the 80s you saw this in the Greater London Council. They started to say that words are the things we need to change. We need to sort of regulate words, so we can't have a socialist society anymore. That's not going to happen. But we can try and regulate words, what people actually say. And in the process of doing that, what they also did was it's not just them, this is a much wider thing, but they helped to construct what are now called vulnerable groups. So I don't know if you know engrams, right? You can do this great search on Google, just put in engrams, and you can search terms in books over 200 years and see when these terms emerged. And the term vulnerable groups emerges, as far as I can remember, in the sort of early 1980s, around there, and just exponentially increases. And essentially what has happened is we've constructed this idea that if you're black, or if you're gay, or if you're a woman, or if you're disabled and so on, you are part of a vulnerable group, or what they now call a protected characteristic. And then the law steps in, because if you're vulnerable, you need more protection, and you need protection from being offended, apparently. And so on it goes. And so we have this kind of radical, essentially there's no one, the people that in the past would have said, wait a minute, we don't want more policing, we don't want more clampdowns, we don't want more people being criminalised. That's what people on the left always argued against the reactionary right. Suddenly they were the ones campaigning to have more laws, more forms of policing, more regulations, more bans, and so on. And I think it's partly because of this, their collapse of their wider political ambitions, if you like. So they became increasingly narrow and focused on language. And then we had this development of this idea of vulnerability, that these people are vulnerable and need to be protected, which is fascinating because it's a complete caricature. If someone said all black people are stupid, you would realize them as a reactionary. But when we say all black people are vulnerable, we get a pat on the head for that. But it's completely patronizing, as far as I can see, to try and categorize people in that way, just as it was in the past.
There's a great example of that last week. The television presenter these days and the peer, Alan Sugar. I can't quite bring myself to call him Lord Sugar, Stuart, so we'll just call him Alan Sugar.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and he put out a tweet about the Senegalese football team and sunglasses sellers and DVD sellers. Now, I happened to live on the Costa del Sol for quite a few years, and he made a silly joke, I'm sure you saw the story, about multitasking. Now, I'm not defending Alan Sugar's opinions or ideas, but what I found strange there was, here were these footballers. Now, you're a big football fan yourself. A lot of the Senegalese lads are playing in European leagues, and some of them are playing in the UK, and they earn a lot of money. They're obviously smart lads. They do very well for themselves, and they've got endorsement deals. They're hardly victims, hardly likely to be wound up or thrown out of step by a stupid meme or a stupid tweet by the likes of Alan Sugar. And yet, overwhelmingly, the media and politicians jumped in to protect these footballers. And this goes to the heart of what you were saying. And Stuart, I wasn't born yesterday. You could never categorise these men as victims of anybody, let alone Alan Sugar, right?
Yeah. Well, there's an added dimension to this, which is politicians don't really seem to have clear convictions. When I was growing up, there was a left and there was a right, and it was quite clear. You would choose a side, if you like, and they seemed to represent something. Whereas today, it's not that clear what they really represent. And they seem to be using victimhood in general, but particularly around these type of issues, to give themselves a sense of moral goodness. So if they have any opportunity to stand up and advocate, say I'm standing up for the voiceless, which is always good for a politician when you can stand up for someone who doesn't have a voice, because you can say whatever you like then. And it gives them a sense of moral goodness. And I saw this in Scotland when they introduced the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which I campaigned against, and they've now got rid of that after it was in for a few years. And you could see it was interesting. Every time someone got up in Parliament, the people that were opposing the act and saying we shouldn't have more policing of language and stuff at football, they would feel the need to say, I'm against sectarianism and racism in all its forms. Right. It was like a mantra. It becomes just a thing you have to say. You have to say this to show that you're a morally decent human being. And I think that's another aspect of it, that it's possibly the biggest aspect of it, actually, that people who are in authority, running institutions, politicians within the media and so on, if this gives them a kind of moral crutch, it's like this is, and it's ironically, it gives them a moral crutch because we all agree with them, because the vast majority of people are against racism, against homophobia, against sexism. In which case you think, well, why do we need all these laws then? Why do we need all these laws? Because the vast majority of people, despite what they think, are actually against this stuff.
Call me a conspiracy theorist if you want. I don't know if you had a look at some of the stuff that we do here, but I am a bit of a conspiracy theorist. I think there's obviously institutions, or there are. Let's look at the pillars of the state, the authoritative pillars of the state. If this carries on going the way it's going, it's those people, the establishment, whether it be politicians, whether it be the financial elites, they'll ultimately benefit from it, Stuart, because they'll be eventually not so much immune to criticism and to questioning, but it'll be basically prohibited to question or to criticise, lest the journalists like me be accused of hatred or racism. I mean, I'm very concerned about all of this stuff about hate speech on Twitter. Now, I'm not saying that when people like Stella Creasy, the Labour politician, I don't find it very amusing that some idiot who's hiding behind a stupid pseudonym on Twitter, and he's probably, hiding in his mother's bedroom when he's on his computer, right? And probably is, right? But he's a clown to be saying stuff like you should be raped and all that. That's ridiculous, that. But I think the reaction to it by politicians and how they're using it, which you're touching on, is equally ridiculous and preposterous, because we have laws against poison pen writing, and Twitter can just delete the guy, or you've got the block function and you don't have to read him again. But it seems like they want to use those examples to bring in a more draconian, Orwellian, almost overseeing of everything we do when we're online, and no good can come of that. So who does that ultimately benefit, is where I was going with that.
Yeah, I think the problem is, I think it's very contradictory in terms of who it actually benefits. And you end up, you now get a situation where you've got the education minister trying to defend academic freedom, because they're conscious that not a lot of students, but a section of students are now getting into this no platforming and safe spaces and so on. So even some of the politicians are starting to recognise that things are getting too far. And I'm very interested. I'm sure you know about the Count Dankula case.
Oh yes, you've written about this. I read your article on it, by the way. It is excellent in the Times. Yeah. In
case people don't know about this is a guy in Airdrie who goes on Facebook and basically sort of like does crude, crass comedy stuff, and he's a bit of a free speech type person, and he. I thought it was quite funny, his little video. I think some people may not find it funny, but I thought it was quite funny. So he gets his his girlfriend has this little pug dog, and she says, "Oh, it's lovely." So he says, the joke is he's going to train it to do a little fascist salute, because he's trying to think of the most horrible thing that you could be. So, yeah. I mean, he's not promoting racism or fascism. He's taking the mick out of it, and you get his video, and the little pug, he's showing like pictures of Hitler and, you know, all that. And the little pug dog is trained to do a little Nazi salute. And he was charged and found guilty for this and fined £800. He's not paying it, so he's challenging it. And I think cases like that are fascinating, because I think they've gone too far. I think even they are going so far that people like Gervais and David Baddiel defended this guy, and they're not particularly extreme in any respect, but they realise that actually this means comedy is in big trouble. You know, if this guy's just cracking a joke, getting a little dog to do a Nazi salute, and they end up being taken to court and potentially imprisoned for doing that, then that is a real problem. So I think I'd be very interested. It's well worth keeping an eye on this case to see how it pans out, because I think that the more they dig and the more extreme it becomes, the more of a problem I think it potentially will be. So yeah, I'm not sure if it benefits anybody.
That's a really interesting point. And I had a friendly Twitter exchange with the journalist from the Jewish Chronicle when I was defending the rights of Alison Shablow to make her satirical songs about Anne Frank. Now, I've interviewed Alison. I don't agree with Alison's contention that there's no proof that anybody was gassed at Auschwitz. I don't agree with that, and I say that. Obviously, I don't. I've been to these places myself. I've been to Dachau and in Munich and places like that. But I was really pleasantly surprised to see the Jewish Chronicle editor, whose name escapes me. I should be ashamed, really, whose name probably will come to me, saying you're absolutely right. We should not be prosecuting and convicting people of doing this stuff just because, you know, we don't like it. If we don't like it, we don't have to look at it. And unless you can show that somebody is genuinely and realistically inciting somebody to commit some harm against somebody else, you should basically stay away from it, or you should challenge in an open forum and debate, which is what we used to do. Let me just do a quick recap. Stuart is going to stay with me for another 10 or so minutes. Dr. Stuart Waiton is live on the line from Dundee, where he's sweltering. I nearly said melting there, but that's become such a negative thing. Melting these days. Everybody's melting down when they hear things they don't like. Stuart is at Abertay University, and he's written several books. The Scared of the Kids, The Politics of Antisocial Behaviour, Amoral Panics. His most recent book is Snob's Law, Criminalising Football Fans in an Age of Intolerance. And I will ask you about your forthcoming book about criminalising everything in a minute or so. So tell me then about you had these experiences at university when everything was up for debate, when everybody was heard and nobody wanted people banned or locked in a room because of their opinions. When you talked a minute ago about deplatforming, and the Daily Mail loves these stories about how university students are given trigger warnings about criminology courses, Stuart, there you are, in case you show some crime scene pictures and they might be triggered by that and they might have to leave. Are you witnessing any of this stuff yourself in your own job?
It's a good question, because, I mean, Dundee's probably a bit behind the trends on this. So it doesn't manifest itself that clearly yet, but I must admit I am becoming a little bit more nervous about, because when I get the first years, the first thing I go into is the idea of criminalising language, and I get them to read a bit of John Stuart Mill and a little bit of Kant in terms of the Enlightenment and stuff like that, and try and get them to think about the idea of liberty and question this idea of offensiveness and being offended, partly because I think within a university setting, it's very important that they actually recognise that offensive ideas are things that should be raised and should be discussed and taken seriously. So it's not that overt in my university, but there is there's a kind of underlying anxiety, but it's also institutions, universities now are doing this thing where they say you have to internationalize the curriculum. The idea being that, it's good to have different voices for every subject, right? So if it's kind of computing or maths or engineering or whatever it is, you want to try and essentially you want to be kind of and have an anti-racist curriculum somehow included. So even at the level of institutions, they're starting to move down this line. So instead of saying, well, actually, the academic should choose who he thinks is good because they're good, because their ideas are good, there's a sort of slight pressure to try and encourage you to sort of, well, could you not get a sort of black author, or a gay author, or a disabled author perhaps? And it's really problematic because it suggests that somehow there is this like different types of ideas based on your color or gender, rather than taking ideas in their own terms. So it's not just at the level of students you're starting to get this. You're starting to also get this at an institutional level, where there's a kind of promotion of what appears to be anti-racist. But I actually think it's the opposite, because it implicit within that is an idea that you have kind of a black type of idea and a woman type of idea, which is, it's almost like sexism and racism.
It is actually
reintroduced. So, it's at different levels you're starting to get this sort of thing. I tell you one thing I think, and I'm not 100% about this, but I think the students are less vocal, I think, and becoming less vocal. And I think it's partly because they don't want to say things that other people might think are offensive.
Self-censorship, Stuart, you're talking about there. This is insidious.
Absolutely. And it's partly the young people today are brought up understanding that being not being offensive is really important, and that you mustn't be offensive, you mustn't be judgmental. And that's a real problem when you come to sort of discussing contentious ideas, because you need to try and make a judgment. You need to try and think about this and make an argument for what you think about different sides and ideas. So that's where I think it's possibly developing the most, that students are less and less likely to speak and be prepared to say things that they think other students might think is judgmental. It's
interesting. I was at a party a house party last weekend, and there was a few drinks in this weather in a house in Shorten, and there's a few people there younger than me, people that work with my partner Caroline, and they were young women, and they were from all over Europe, and we were telling funny stories about being mortified by our parents when we were sent to fancy dress competitions when we were children. And I was telling a not too funny story about being sent out by my mother with a sombrero and a pair of girls' cowboy boots to be a Mexican person. And I said my mum drew a moustache on me with, I think, an eyeliner pen, but she screwed it up and it was square, so I ended up with a bowl haircut. I ended up looking more like Hitler than a Mexican, right? So that was fine. But a few minutes later, another girl kind of said to me, I can't believe you said that. This girl over here, Zoe, she's German. And I said, you're shitting me, right? And she said, no, serious, I can't believe you said German. That's a bit insensitive. And I said, no, it's not. Hitler had a square moustache and I looked a bit like Hitler. And I'm not rude, but obviously, the job I'm doing, confrontation, I argue with people all the time. I just kind of walked away and I shook my head and I thought, is this what it's coming to? You can't say anything. You've got to walk on eggshells around people. Impose this kind of a self-censorship on yourself. It's scary stuff. I mean, it sounds almost like, melodramatic, like over-exaggerating it, but we're not. How are we going to get around that with younger men and women? Again, which sounds patronising. I mean, we're not old either, you or I, but how are we going to get them to maybe look at that and think that's not a good way to think, and it's certainly not a good way to challenge things, because everything should be up for challenge all the time, everything. What are we going to do?
Well, to be honest with you, I think a lot of students agree. A lot of students think, actually, you should be able to have an open discussion and so on. It's just the kind of climate that exists makes it more difficult, I think, for people to talk about these things. And I mean, I must admit, I was talking to a couple of relatively young people. One's 17, the other one's probably about 21, about the whole transgender thing.
Yeah.
And I was questioning this idea. So I watched was it First Dates Hotel? And there was a gay guy ends up with a transgender woman who's now a guy. And it was just interesting when you're watching this program, and this person who's now says they're a man, and all the rest of it look like a man, sound like a man, and so on. And say, well, I was born in the wrong body, and I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just not possible. You know, it's like, it's not possible to be born in the wrong body. It's almost like a form of mysticism. I mean, you might decide that you want to have a sex change or whatever, and you know, people can do that if they want to. But the idea that, so I was just questioning with these two young people, right, and saying, well, yeah, but it's not possible, is it? You can't be born in the wrong body. It doesn't. I mean, which body should they have been born into?
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's just not. It's not real. It's not possible, right? Now, so they might feel like something. That's fine. And if they want later on in life, they want to do something, that's entirely up to them. But this idea of being born in the wrong body, and honestly, I felt like an alien. I felt like an alien because and in the end, they just said, they just said to one another, it's a generational thing, right? As if kind of I'm just like an old sort of person from the dark ages.
You're finished now, Stuart. You're gone. You're done with now. That's it, yeah.
Who doesn't understand. And it's the first time that's happened to me, where it was a kind of, you know, the age I am meant that I could just be dismissed. You know, my idea, we don't have to listen to you. Thank you. You know, almost pat me on the head, you know, get my wheelchair out, whatever, shove me off the corner. Because it's just one of those things you can't, you know, that's my generation apparently, means that I can't possibly understand this thing. So I must admit, I was horrified by this experience in this discussion, especially because there was no scope for having a discussion. It was just,
shut down.
You're old, so you don't get it. End of story. We find you offensive, and you're uncaring and so on. End of story. So yes, I think you're right to be worried, because I'm a bit worried.
I've got to be careful at parties where anybody is 5 years younger than me or more. So we're just about out of time. You've got to rush off yourself anyway. When will the criminalisation of everything hit the shelves? Because I sincerely can't wait to read it. When will it be out?
That's a good question. I'm just collecting material for it at the minute, so it's at least a year away. At least a year. But if people are interested in this subject, they should have a look at the Snob's Law book, especially if they're interested in football, because I try and trace the history, if you like, of censorship and policing of language in football. So that's worth a read.
Absolutely. Snob's Law, Criminalising Football Fans in an Age of Intolerance. Available at all good bookstores and the most famous online retailer as well. Check it out. I was reading about it as I was kind of swatting up on Stuart and what he's been doing. I'd like to ask you a favour. When you have a bit of time in the autumn, come back on, because I was fascinated to read your work on the Named Persons Act in Scotland. Something else which worries me. And I've done a lot to do with child protection on this programme, with academics and with social workers and all the rest of it. And I think you're doing amazing work, Stuart. How could I, or why would I dare patronise you? I'm not doing that. The work is absolutely vital in this kind of creeping intolerance age that we're in. So I'd love you to come back in the autumn and talk more. In the meantime, 2 quick questions before you go. How far will England go, and what's going to become of your beloved Mackems?
Sunderland will go nowhere for 10 years, I think.
Oh, no.
I can see no way up. They might get into the Championship, but so I can't see any real progress there for a decade.
What a shame.
England, I think my worry with England is the defence. I think we've got goals in us. I think we've got pace and energy, and watch out for Lingard. I think he's a very underestimated player. So I think he's quite important to the team. Obviously Harry Kane, but I'm a little bit nervous about the defence. I'm a bit nervous about Walker being centre back. I think he's out of position. So if we can defend, we have a chance of going somewhere.
Maybe the semis, maybe.
Possibly. I mean, to be honest with you, from what I've seen and the bits I've watched, nobody's been that impressive so far. But I think Brazil might still, on paper, Brazil are the team to beat. It's
made for a very exciting tournament, as you said, because nobody's been impressive. The Germans are gone. Folks, you've just been listening to Dr. Stuart Waiton. Stuart is a senior lecturer at the Sociology Department at Abertay University. Thanks for your time, Stuart. Fascinating stuff. I really enjoyed it, mate.
Yep, no bother.
Enjoy the summer. Thanks a lot. Bye for now. Stuart Waiton there. Fascinating stuff.